All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for being here. We have a large number of people on the call, and that's really exciting for us because that shows that there's a lot of interest in this topic, right? And of course, we're always pleased to bring you Michael Osterman from Osterman Research. Under his direction, we'll be discussing the move to the cloud and best practices on how to do that. Michael is an industry expert and is the president and founder of Osterman Research. He has over 27 years of experience in the high-tech research industry and has spent 16 of those years following specifically the messaging and collaboration industries. Um, One item to take note of is we will have time for Q&A at the end of the webinar. If you have any questions as we go along, please feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A, those screens there that you see, and we will make sure to address those at the end of the webinar. And also, just so everyone is aware, this webinar is being recorded, and everyone who's on this webinar who registered will receive a link to that recording, and everyone on this webinar also will receive a link to the Osterman white paper that complements this webinar, which is Migration to Office 365, a step-by-step guide. So take a look and make sure to look for that email. We'll be getting you that shortly. And we'll make sure to allow some time for questions at the end. So at that moment, you will have the ability to ask those questions. And once again, if you have questions, feel free to put those through as we go along. And we're really excited for this topic. Once again, like I said, a lot of people are on this call, and that shows that a lot of people are interested in this topic today. So we'll go ahead and turn the time over to Michael. Thanks again for being here, and thanks especially to Michael for this presentation. Michael.
Well, Hugh, thank you so much. And I'd like to thank everybody who's here on the call with us today. We have a very good audience, and it obviously expresses the great interest that a lot of people have in migrating to Office 365. So just a bit about Osterman Research so you understand our perspective in this. We're an independent market research and consulting firm, and our focus really is on communication and collaboration in a workplace context. So we talk to IT decision makers and influencers as well as end users, really to understand what's going on in the context of how they communicate, how they collaborate, how and why they want to move to the cloud, and so forth. We have a strong emphasis on primary research. We'll be presenting a bit of that here today. The company's about 15 years old, and we're based near Seattle. And thankfully, that picture of Seattle looks kind of like it does today, sort of an unusual situation this time of year. So, let's get right into it. I mean, cloud email is growing. We hear a lot about the cloud. We hear about email and CRM and lots of other applications that are moving to the cloud, and that very definitely is the case. What we found from a recent survey is that today about 3 out of 5 business email users in North America are served by some version of on-premises Exchange. Lots served by Office 365 as well as a variety of other on-premises solutions, other cloud solutions, and so forth. What we're finding, though, is that we're going to see a flip-flop over the next couple of years where about half of users are going to be served by Office 365 or maybe just Exchange Online, and we're going to see a corresponding decrease in the proportion of business users that are served by on-premises. So lots of organizations are moving to the cloud. They are moving specifically to some flavor of Office 365, largely because there are lots of really good capabilities within Office 365, and Microsoft has done a very good job at integrating a wide variety of capabilities and capabilities that continue to be expanded upon over time. Now, that's not to say that other solutions aren't going to be used. There are other cloud solutions. On-premises is still here to stay for many years to come, but we are seeing a fairly significant shift to the cloud, and in particular, a major shift to Office 365. So why are organizations migrating? Well, it varies, based on the size of the organization, the geographic reach, the internal philosophy about the cloud, the cost of ownership and so forth. But primarily the biggest reason for moving to Office 365 is to reduce the cost of delivering email. If you look at the true cost of email, and that's when you consider all of the costs involved, it's actually a fairly expensive proposition to do it internally. And it's also expensive to do it in the cloud. Let's not kid ourselves. But if you do migrate to the cloud, very often you can significantly reduce the cost of email. Also, the migration of the cloud is in part the ability to enable agility in a changing operating environment, meaning you can have employees more distributed across the country. You can hire people anywhere in the world. You can work more effectively with people when they're traveling, when they're remote, and so forth. So agility is also a major component of the drivers for migrating to Office 365, as well as other cloud-based solutions. A lot of organizations think that they can get better user productivity by going to Office 365, largely because there's an integration of various capabilities within the platform, not only email, but also real-time communications, voice telephony, and really a wide and expanding set of offerings that are included as part of the package. Also, you can gain certainty over costs. And this is really one of the primary advantages of the cloud, is that you know up front what your costs are going to be. When you manage things on premises, you can get a decent handle on costs, but there can be surprises. Things can break. You may need to add servers or appliances periodically. With the cloud, you really don't need to do that. Those surprises still happen, but now they're borne by Microsoft or some other cloud provider. You don't have to bear those costs as a customer. And also, a lot of organizations want to streamline IT operations by going to the cloud, and specifically Office 365. And finally, a lot of organizations think that they can improve organizational communication. And very often that's true, because now, particularly for remote users, they have all of their communications capabilities in one package. So they can access everything from one device instead of needing a separate computer and telephone and other devices. So the fundamental issue, though, about migrating is that it's really not a very simple proposition. It's not just moving users over, flipping a switch, and you're done. There are lots of things to consider, particularly in the context of Office 365. For example, there are new versions and devices. Most of the Office 365 plans provide access to new versions of current tools, whether that's online editions of Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and so forth, or the right to run Office apps on computers, mobile devices, and smartphones. And the new versions have upgraded and many times new capabilities that users are going to need to learn, such as for touch-enabled devices. There are new user interaction paradigms and so forth. There are a number of new tools available in Office 365, things that will better support communication and collaboration. As just one example, Delve uses machine learning technologies that can surface relevant content that can be personalized for each and every user, and it keeps those users informed about what's happening in the organizational network. Yammer, for example, provides a set of social tools for communication, things like sharing updates, working together, and so forth. There are also some new work practices to consider. The new tools, for example, in Office 365 allow for the introduction of new work practices, such as changing from using email for distributing in-progress documents, which is really the most common way of sharing files today, to shifting over to OneDrive for Business, SharePoint, or Yammer, some other tool that's perhaps more efficient at sharing files, but that requires a change in the paradigm of doing so. Employees can stop using their phone and, in many cases, embrace Skype for Business for presence awareness, doing quick chats, making voice calls, and so forth. But again, it requires a paradigm shift in helping users to understand how they need to change. There are new and different server capabilities, new value-added services, new places for sharing files. Again, another paradigm shift that is involved with migrating to Office 365, and so it's not just a case of moving users over, but it's moving them over and helping them to understand new ways of doing work. And finally, there are new demands on connectivity. Organizations that are leveraging cloud-based business applications of any kind require a fairly distributed network architecture so that they can optimize the performance of their network. The move to a distributed model gives individual site locations local internet connectivity to ensure a very good work environment is maintained, but it does require a new way of thinking about networks, and it can require upgrades or major changes to a network if an organization really isn't prepared for it. In terms of the loss of control, there is going to be some loss of control as you move to the cloud. Certainly you can regain most of or you can keep most of the control you've already had, but things like upgrade cycles you may have less control over. You may have users that get automatically upgraded to a new version of some Microsoft Office 365 application, and that's going to require some calls to the help desk. It's going to be disruptive in many ways. So you do have some loss of control that you need to take into account. You need to consider that migrating from various types of on-premises tools or other cloud solutions is going to be problematic in some cases. There is going to be a need in many cases for an external migration consultant to come in and help the organization with that migration so that you can maintain chain of custody for the content that you've archived, for the content that is in users' mailboxes, and so forth. And finally, you need to consider how long it's going to take. A migration, particularly for a larger company, can take quite a while. It's not just a matter of doing everybody over a weekend and having everybody up and running on Monday morning. This can take several weeks or months depending upon the size of the organization and how committed IT is to getting things done quickly. So in terms of thinking about the migration, there really are a variety of factors you need to consider. First is you need to focus on the various Office 365 plans. And at this count, I think there's something like 14 different SKUs that you need to consider. Various flavors of Office 365 for commercial organizations, educational, government organizations, and so forth. So there are lots of different SKUs that you need to consider, and you need to right-size each SKU to the particular roles in your organization. You may have, for example, clerical staff that need more basic capabilities than maybe power users or senior managers or people in legal or compliance or HR. So you're going to need to match the requirements of the role with the specific capabilities in the various versions of Office 365, largely because you don't want to overspend. You don't want to provide somebody with a full-blown enterprise E5 package when they can get by maybe with an E3 package. So it's about saving money, but also right-sizing those capabilities. And there really are only two practical approaches. Either go 100% cloud where everything is Office 365, or use some sort of a hybrid environment. And what we found in our research is that more than a quarter of organizations are going to stay long-term with a hybrid environment. You can move some or most of the on-premises capabilities to Office 365, but in many cases it makes sense to retain some capabilities on-premise. For example, almost all organizations should retain an Active Directory server and all of the tooling for managing users, but other capabilities for various types of purposes might also be retained on premises over the long term. You might have some email generating applications. You might have things like copiers and printers and scanners that are tied into the email infrastructure, and it simply doesn't make sense to move everything lock, stock, and barrel to the cloud because it would be too expensive, because your bandwidth requirements would go up far too much. Maybe it just doesn't make sense. You don't use those applications enough, but there are still legacy applications that you do depend on to some extent, or some of your users depend on. So for a lot of organizations, it's simply going to make sense to stay with a hybrid environment. That adds some level of complication because now you're managing some on-premises infrastructure as well as some in the cloud. So organizations need to plan up front how they're going to do the migration and what their environment is going to look like over the long term. And finally, as I mentioned, in many cases you are going to need outside help. You're going to need experts in the migration process so that you can easily move, or as easily as possible, move users' inboxes. And particularly if you have a lot of archived content, it's going to make sense to have a consultant that can help you with that archiving process and the migration process, because it's very easy to mess things up and to damage data during the process of migration. So also you're going to need to plan on a reliable network. You're going to have very reliable internet connectivity. Today, email is a mission-critical application, as it will continue to be for many years to come. And it's highly dependent on very good internet connectivity. And as you move to Office 365 or any cloud-based application for that matter, the reliability of your internet connectivity is going to become more important. Bandwidth issues, again, a very important concern, because now you've got a lot more traffic on your network, and you don't want to have the network be the bottleneck in the productivity that you're trying to achieve with Office 365. You're also going to need to focus on whether you want a centralized or decentralized firewall topology. Again, a very important consideration. particularly for organizations that are going to be maintaining some sort of a hybrid environment. Now there's a variety of other issues as well. You need to focus on email security. That becomes more complicated if you want a hybrid environment. Microsoft has done a very good job at building security into Office 365, and they've got some very nice capabilities around traditional anti-spam and antivirus and anti-malware protection, but also DLP. But in many cases, those capabilities aren't going to be enough. And we recommend for a lot of organizations, if not most, consider third parties as supplements to the capabilities that you'll get in Office 365, or maybe even as wholesale replacements, particularly if you have a hybrid environment where you have some non-Microsoft technologies in place as well. It's going to be very important to have a set of third-party capabilities that are going to allow you to manage all of the systems that you currently manage. Compliance and e-discovery. Microsoft has done a pretty good job at building good compliance and e-discovery capabilities into Office 365, but again, they're not going to be all things to all companies, and so you're going to need to focus on tools that are going to best match your requirements. Archiving is another critical issue. Not everything within Office 365 is archived, and it becomes even more of a problem when you have non-Microsoft technologies that are generating content that you have to archive. So again, we highly recommend the consideration of third-party tools that can help you with a more holistic archiving capability. Then you need to focus on disaster recovery and business continuity. And that's one of the real advantages of the cloud is that Microsoft is going to be doing that for you, or whatever cloud provider you choose. They are going to be dealing with a lot of the disaster recovery and business continuity issues, but they can't deal with everything. You're going to have your own strategy, particularly if you have a hybrid environment where some of your data, some of your infrastructure is on premises. And then finally, backup. Again, Microsoft is going to back up the content in Office 365, but there may be content from your mobile devices, from on-premises systems and so forth that you're going to need to take into account. And so you'll have to have an integrated backup strategy that allows for backup in the cloud in some cases, as well as backup on site. And going to the cloud, again, does mean having some level of on-premises capabilities. Even if you decide you want to go 100% to the cloud, if you're a mid-sized or large organization, in many cases you're still going to need to have some level of Active Directory on premises. There's going to need to be some pre-migration upgrades that take place for your on-premises systems. And you are going to have to really seriously evaluate your bandwidth so that you have the internet capacity to support a full and robust Office 365 experience. And then you need to plan on moving lots of terabytes of data, particularly if you're a larger company. Are you going to do that over the internet? Are you simply going to ship physical media? That's a very important consideration because if you're dealing with several terabytes of information, it's going to take a long time to migrate all of that data. And so you need to have an appropriate strategy that's going to allow you to migrate within an appropriate length of time. Also, in terms of managing the migration process, you need to fix problems in Exchange. There are a lot of corrupt Exchange installations out there, and so you're going to need to fix those problems before you migrate. You're going to have to implement, in many cases, some very robust email security capabilities that maybe you don't have now, maybe that aren't going to match your needs in Office 365. And you need to consider a variety of other things. You need to archive unnecessary data, maybe, and decide what to do with it, maybe defensively delete it. Most organizations today do not have a defensible deletion policy, and so they don't know what they can safely delete. And in the absence of a good defensible deletion policy, you're going to potentially be migrating lots of data, maybe many terabytes of data that you just don't need, that you can safely get rid of. But in the absence of that policy, you don't know if you can or not. You're going to have to locate and deal with PST files around your organization. And there are lots of organizations that have PST files scattered absolutely everywhere, all over the organization. You're going to need to migrate or retain your archived data, and you need to make decisions about what you can keep, what you're going to keep on premises, what you're going to migrate to the cloud, and so forth. It may be, for example, that you have old SharePoint data, old email data, old data from other sources that you just don't need to migrate into the cloud, into Office 365, but you don't feel safe in getting rid of that data. So you're going to have a strategy for having an archive on premises and potentially one in the cloud. you need to identify data that's on legal hold, because if you're a mid-sized or large organization, it's a pretty safe bet you have some data today that's on legal hold, and it's going to have to stay on legal hold as you migrate to Office 365. That complicates things. It doesn't make it impossible, obviously, but it does complicate things, and so that's going to be another consideration that you need to focus on. And then finally, you need to deal with inactive mailboxes. Organizations have people that have left. They've retained those the content in those mailboxes. You need to decide what to do with that. Are you going to set up new accounts on Office 365 for it? Are you going to archive it off to some sort of an on-premises archive? Are you going to put it into a cloud-based archive? You need to make that decision up front before you begin the migration process. So what is it you should migrate? Well, from a survey we did on Office 365 migration, we found, not surprisingly, that the vast majority of organizations are going to migrate their existing PST files. Organizations have thousands or tens or hundreds of thousands of these files, and they need to migrate those into the new Office 365 environment. You have, in many cases, content from existing on-premises archiving solutions. There are legacy archiving solutions, and many organizations will want to migrate either some or all of that content into 365. There are databases from non-Microsoft on-premises email systems. In many cases, you might want to migrate that data. You might want to keep it on premises. There is content from existing non-Microsoft cloud-based email systems. Again, adding some level of complication, particularly if you have various cloud-based applications, maybe like Dropbox or other cloud-based email systems, what have you. That content is going to have to either be migrated into 365 or dealt with in some way. And finally, you have content from existing cloud-based archives. You need to decide what you're going to do with that, again, as sort of a pre-migration activity. PST files, again, obviously are the most important thing, but there's lots of other content that you need to consider before you start the migration process. So in terms of the current state of archiving, what we found is that today just over half of total email traffic is archived today, and that's going to increase fairly substantially over the next 24 months. These numbers should be at 100%. Organizations should be archiving their business records in email. Many today are not. We find a lot of organizations that have maybe 30 or 60 or 90-day purge cycles, and they're just not archiving their content, and that puts them at fairly serious risk. They should be archiving the appropriate business records in email and other sources, and many are not. That's another issue as you migrate to Office 365. You need to decide on an archiving strategy. Are you going to stay with the one you have now, or is that going to change somehow as you move to the cloud? But what about other content types? Again, if you have business records, regardless of the format, whether they're on paper or in email, wherever they are, they need to be stored somewhere over the long term, and you need to make them tamper-proof, you need to make them searchable, and so forth. But there are lots of other sources of information. Now, while email has traditionally been the best place to start archiving because most of the content you're going to need for things like e-discovery or regulatory compliance are stored in email, there are lots of other content types to consider because those contain some sort of business record, whether that's in social media of some kind like Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn or wherever it might be. It might be in SharePoint. It might be in Dropbox. There are hundreds of potential places where you are storing business records, where you have archivable content that should be stored in some sort of a long-term archive. And that's particularly true in Office 365 because by design, Office 365 is email-centric, but it also includes capabilities around SharePoint, Yammer, Skype for Business, lots of other tools, and all of those can contain business records that need to be archived. And natively, Office 365 does not archive all of the content types that you can generate. And so you're going to need, in many cases, a third-party archiving solution that will store content from all of those Microsoft and non-Microsoft applications so that you can preserve those business records as you're supposed to do for legal and regulatory purposes. So in terms of best practice recommendations, certainly we recommend the use of a cloud-based security solution in front of Office 365. It's going to assure a cleaner email flow in many cases. Now, while that's not absolutely necessary, it's a good best practice to follow because there are some third-party security solutions that do provide enhanced capabilities beyond what Microsoft has provided in Office 365. And that layered approach really does make sense, even in the cloud. Certainly, layering has been a best practice for many, many years, and that doesn't go away when you migrate to Office 365. You need to consider that the data migration process is absolutely and critically important. You need to ensure the integrity of all of the data that you're moving into Office 365. You need to absolutely strictly maintain chain of custody so that you can prove the authenticity of that information, so that you can demonstrate it was not modified in any way as it got migrated into Office 365 or into some sort of a cloud-based archive. You need to ensure that legal holds are maintained. That's absolutely essential because if data goes off legal hold, it can be deleted and it creates an enormous risk for your organization if you're involved in any sort of litigation at the time of the migration. You need to focus on security for file sharing. There's absolute requirements for protecting data that's used in file sharing systems, and Office 365 makes very heavy use of OneDrive for file sharing, and that's in addition to what users might be employing in Dropbox or whatever cloud file sharing tool they happen to use at the moment. Then finally, you need to consider the implications of Lync, which is now Skype for Business, Yammer, all of the tools that are involved in the Office 365 suite. You need to look at how each of those are going to work in your organization, the data they're going to be generating, how you need to archive that data, how you need to protect it, what security you need to apply, and so forth. Okay, and that concludes my part of the presentation. Here's our contact information, and Q, I'd like to turn the floor back to you.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks everyone for your attendance here. Once again, if you have questions, feel free to put those through in the chat and the Q&A. There's just a few things that I wanted to talk about really quick at the end here. For all of you who are on or going to Office 365, we have a great product with Retain to really help with that archiving piece that Michael was talking about when it comes to e-discovery, archiving, and compliance. And what's great as well with Retain is we have complete archiving of all Office 365 plans. As Michael talked about, there's a chance that maybe you're just looking to do email with Office 365, and so you're on an E1 or a Business Essentials plan. You can still do archiving with Retain Unified Archiving. And with Retain Unified Archiving, there's built-in litigation support with e-discovery and redaction. That's something that we can add on to your investment into Office 365, is that ability to perform redaction. The other great thing with Retain is that you can archive more than just Office 365. You can actually archive other email systems. So if you're making that transition, so say that you're that you're using Exchange today and you want to archive that, you can archive Exchange, plus we can archive Office 365. So as you're making that transition from an on-premise thing to something that's in the cloud, you can still archive what you currently have, and as you're making that transition, be able to tie Office 365 to it. So it actually helps with migrations as well. So in addition to the email archiving, Retain also archives mobile and social media, as well as mobile communications in iOS, Android, and BlackBerry. And also to help with this move to Office 365, or to help with your ability to archive Office 365, we've partnered with a great premium partner with Microsoft, and that's RyanTech. RyanTech, they are one of the premier gold partners for Microsoft, and they're one of the leading providers of Office 365 and Exchange Online. So if you're making that move, we have the ability to get you Office 365 and allow you to archive it with Retain Unified Archiving. And like I stated, here's all of the platforms that are supported with Retain. And so it's more than just that email, and that's why we call it Retain Unified Archiving, is that there's the archiving of social media and mobile communication all in one central location. One other thing, I wanted to just make a great announcement for those of you who might not have heard. Guava is now part of the Micro Focus company. So we're part of that company now, which actually helps us to support you better. There's a great suite of products that Micro Focus offers, and now the Guava products, including Retain, is one of them that Micro Focus offers. So keep an eye out, because there's going to be great things coming in Retain as well with this new acquisition of Guava by Micro Focus. So the next steps. Obviously, one thing I wanted to make mention to everybody on this call is that this webinar is being recorded, so you will get a recording and an email with the recording, with the presentation, and with that link to the white paper from Michael Osterman. If you're interested in more information about Retain in particular, you can get a personalized demo at guava.com/product demo. You can even contact us as well to learn more. So it looks like we do have a few questions that we're going to get to. If anyone wants to unmute and ask a question, we'll do that in just a minute. Let me first get to the ones that are in the thing here. So, Michael, I think this one is for you. The question is, will PST folders convert automatically when Office 365 is rolled out?
That's a great question. I don't believe so. I believe that there's some manual processes involved, but I will double check on that just to make sure, and I can provide that answer to you, and you can get it to the person asking the question.
Perfect. So yeah, Karen, we'll get that on. And so there's another one here that's similar. Is will document spreadsheets and other items created in the version of Microsoft Office that an entity is currently using, will it convert to Office 365? So I think that's a similar question. I don't know if you have the answer to that one.
Yes, actually, that should not be a problem at all. The file format that's used in Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, for example, I think has been the same since Office 2010. So that won't change with Office 365. Because basically the Office applications you're getting in 365 are the same ones that you can buy off the shelf and install locally. Basically, when you get Office 365 that includes a plan beyond just Exchange Online, you're getting the ability to download those Office applications and use them for the length of the subscription.
We did have another one come through in the chat. Is what's the best resource for planning Exchange hybrid migration to Exchange Online while using a local Active Directory?
Microsoft itself has some pretty good resources in helping organizations to maintain hybrid, and that's going to, we normally would recommend, going through a consultant organization of some kind, because there are lots of different permutations for hybrid that you need to consider, and it's a fairly complicated thing to do, and you need to do some appropriate planning. So we'd recommend a consultant, but again, Microsoft has some decent resources, and they have focused on hybrid and are continuing to do that more. Microsoft realizes that many of its customers that are migrating to Office 365 are going to be maintaining hybrid deployments for many years to come. And so they've done a good job and are continuing to do a good job at helping organizations to do that.
So that looks like there was just a couple of comments, and I wanted to make mention of that. Is we had one person say that they have had experience with the old .xls and .doc formats, so the older formats that don't convert when they go to Office 365. So that's something to be aware of. Let's see. Another one here for Michael is, we have a large customer base. When we migrate to Office 365, will we have issues opening documents from entities that are in a lesser Office environment and vice versa? I think that was answered by the other one, that there has been some issues with older Office environments, but anything to add to that?
Yeah, we haven't really come across that very much. If you have a newer version of an Office application that generally does a good job at opening the older versions, it'll want to convert it to the new one, but we haven't had much of an issue. Now, it is an issue if you go back. For example, if you have an XLSX document in Excel, opening that with an older version of Excel can be problematic.
Great. And then there was one for me that's, if we're currently using Retain for email, is it an additional license to use it for social media? Yes, there is. It's not an additional license. I wouldn't call it a license, but it's an additional module. So there is additional modules for the mobile archiving and for the social media archiving piece. But since if you have Retain for email, you already have the server license, so it's just a small additional add-on module. And so yeah, that goes for anything. If you want to use email today and archive social media or mobile later, that's just something that you would add on. Okay, let's see. Any other questions that anyone has? Feel free to put that through. Good questions. Thanks for putting these through. Let's see. Here's one that came through. Cross-platform permissions such as calendar sharing has been a nightmare for me. Is there a tool an admin can use to find out who has been moved along with the user you're planning to move?
That's a very good question, and I don't know.
I think that's something.
Let me do some investigation and see if we can find out.
I think that's something as well that, as Michael said, would be helpful to get somebody in to help with that migration to be able to answer all those questions. Thanks, Michael. Good one. Okay. And then, what is the best approach for handling group-wise archives? Is that, if as a follow-up, is that moving the group-wise archives?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to depend on your particular situation. If you have older data in a group-wise archive that you're not going to access very frequently, it might make sense just to maintain an on-premises group-wise archive for the occasional instances where you're going to have to go back into that. It's not an easy thing to migrate from a group-wise archive into Office 365 or some other cloud-based archive. It can be done, but if you're not going to be accessing the data very frequently, particularly if it's maybe 3 or more years old, it just might not make economic sense to do that.
And then, speaking from the retain side of it, if you're using retain or if you're interested in retain, you can actually maintain both. So you could archive group-wise and tie that to the retain system. And then if you're going to Exchange or Office 365, you can archive that as well in retain. So you can actually maintain one central archive and not have to maintain two separate systems and have that one archive with the retain unified archiving solution. Okay, and that looks like all the questions. Once again, if you have any other questions, feel free to put those through. We do have a few minutes here. That looks like everything it looks for this webinar on the questions. If you have any other questions, you can feel free to reach out to us, and we'd like to thank once again Michael Osterman for his time and for the information presented, and we'd like to thank everyone who was on this call and for your interest in this topic. And just a reminder, one last thing that I wanted to put a plug in for everybody is we have other webinars that are upcoming. We actually have one tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern that actually focuses on what retain does for Office 365 and Exchange when it comes to archiving. If you're interested in that or any other webinars, feel free to visit us at guava.com/webinars to register. And then also all recorded webinars are at youtube.com/guavatv. Once again, thanks everyone for being here, and we hope to see you on the next one.